and then we'll get started. So I know it's been a while, but back in Unit 2, when we were doing Python, we saw databases. So this is not our first foray with databases. We've worked with them before, but now we're doing things on the Java side using Spring MVC instead of Python Flask. And so things have changed quite a bit. And I know that during Unit 2, this was kind of a confusing topic for certain reasons. And so some of those issues will probably pop back up as we talk about this again over the next week. But let's talk about how Spring does things. First off, I think it's really important, the prep work covered this, but I think it's really important to try and demystify a lot of what these pieces are that we're working with. There are three main parts: Spring Data, JPA, and Hibernate that we're actually working with this week. And it sounds like a lot, but each one of these libraries, each one of these things has its own part to play, its own role in data persistence, in data access. And I think it's important as programmers to kind of have an idea of what the role is of each of these parts. So what is Spring Data doing for us? What part of the data management piece does Spring Data do for us? What's its role? We have our program and we have a database, and all three of these things that I just talked about are sitting in between our program and the database. And so the question is, where along that path are they sitting, right? Where along that path do these pieces lie? So where's Spring Data come in that equation? Anybody? No? That's fine. So Spring Data is actually the library that's closest to our application. You can think of Spring Data as interacting with the controllers. So we've got controllers in our applications. We've got, we saw the ones for cheese. We're about to make some controllers for categories here in a little bit. So all of our controllers want to manipulate data. They want to manipulate information. And now the way that we're going to do that is through a database. So our controllers need to have access to data in a database in order to perform their job, in order to perform their function. And so Spring Data is basically how our application, our controllers, interact with the other parts of the program that manipulate the database. That's what it's for. So you can think of it as, if you think of data access as like a pipeline, right? Spring Data is pretty close to the front end of that pipeline, close to what the user sees, close to what we're working with on the Spring side of things. All right, what about JPA? Does anybody know what JPA is doing for us? Or even what JPA stands for? I heard somebody say it. Java Persistence API. So Java Persistence API is not part of Spring, it's just part of Java in general. And it's basically what Java has set up to interact with databases. So Java has tools to, Java has ways of, I think the prep work calls it a standard, right? It standardizes the way we access databases. So I can clearly mark things that say, hey, this is the primary key for this particular object. This has a relationship with this particular object over here. When you're doing things like that, when you're actually specifying pieces of your model and how they interact with each other, you're using JPA. So if you're doing work in the controller, right, you're doing stuff accessing models in the controller class, that's Spring Data that's doing that for you. If you're doing things where you're actually setting up your models, connecting models together, those data access objects, which you can see are on my list to talk to you about, also fall under JPA, right? That's all JPA stuff. And JPA, again, is not unique to Spring. If you want to use some other framework besides Spring to build your application, you can still use JPA. It is a standard. It's widely used across many different applications, whereas Spring Data, of course, is just going to be for Spring. And then last, but certainly not least, Hibernate. So again, if we think of our data as a pipeline flowing from our application to our database and back, it goes both directions, right? Hibernate sits closest to the database. Hibernate is closer to the database side than the application side. So you can think of Hibernate, the prep work says that it contains an implementation of the JPA standard, which is true, but what that really means is that JPA does not know what database you have, or it doesn't even really care what kind of database you have. Could be a MySQL database, it could be, there's lots of different kinds of databases out there. It could be an Oracle database, could just be a text file or some other form of data storage that's not even a database, right? Those are all potential options. JPA doesn't care. Hibernate cares. Hibernate is designed to work with specific databases like MySQL, which is what we're using in this particular case. So Hibernate is what manages all of that for us, make sure that we can log into the database, make sure that queries that are sent to the database get processed, and that the results of those queries get sent back to the application. So it's more on the back end, on the back side of that data pipeline. We actually, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, aren't going to be doing a lot with Hibernate directly. A lot of what Hibernate does is kind of behind the scenes. It's necessary for us to do our job, but you might have noticed that as we go on, we're setting up more and more things that sort of does some of the work for us. There's another time today when that's going to happen, where we actually write code that makes it so we don't have to write a lot more code. We just let the computer handle it for us. Hibernate is very big in that realm as well. Hibernate is going to do a lot of work for us on the back end, and we're not even going to see all that work that happens. It's just kind of magic. It's just one less thing that we have to worry about as programmers. We're going to let Hibernate do its thing and focus on what we care about, which is the application side. That's what we're really focused on. Are there any questions about that? I know it's a lot. It still may be potentially confusing. Yeah.
Just wondering behind the curtain and about all the magic. Is it really a bus from Spring Data, then GPA, Hibernate, then database, or and Spring? I don't know. Cross it.
I mean, that's maybe a little bit of a simplification. So the question was, is it really just a straight line between those things from the database and back? And it's maybe a little bit of a simplification, but not much. That's really pretty much what's going on in our application. But that being said, that's not the only way to do it. And while that's how things are working right now for us, because we've chosen to use these frameworks for this course, you can use Hibernate by itself if you want to. You can use JPA by itself if you want to. Those are freely available tools that can interact with many different programs across many different setups. Can be used independently. Spring Data is part of Spring and actually does need JPA, and I don't think it needs Hibernate, but Hibernate's a very popular tool to use with it. So Spring Data does lean heavily on JPA and in this case Hibernate to do its job properly. But JPA and Hibernate are completely independent tools that can be used separately on any project that you would like. So it's possible to bypass certain parts of this, I suppose. The reason that we don't is because they make our lives easier, right? We're using these because they make our lives easier. In fact, if you go online, actually I kind of wish I had done this before class, I just thought of it now. It would have been kind of nice to show you what it would have looked like if we didn't have these tools, what we would have had to have done. Because that's how it used to be, actually. These tools didn't always exist. And if I wanted to use a database, I basically had to do everything that these tools are now doing for us myself. That's how the world used to work. And it used to take a lot of time and a lot more code to manage. So you can still find older applications that work that way, but more modern applications will lean on these kinds of libraries. It's just a huge time saver. Great question. Any other questions? No? Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, let's get more into the specifics of how this stuff all works. How do we declare a model class? How do we say that this is one of my models? What do I need to say? Entity, so that's an annotation, right? And annotations belong to which category? Where do those fall in? JPA, yeah, JPA. When I'm using annotations, I'm writing JPA code, that's correct. How do we allow the database to manage the primary key? Remember, this has sort of been a point of contention for us over the last couple classes. We set up we didn't call it a primary key because we didn't have a database, right? But we were managing our own IDs. We used a static variable to do it. It worked kind of. Actually, I talked to a few of you the last time I was here about some of the loopholes or not loopholes, but some of the weaknesses of that system. Wasn't perfect. There were some problems with it, but it kind of worked. Kind of got the job done. Now we don't have to mess with that anymore. How do we let the database manage our primary key for us? What's that look like in our code? We have an ID, and then there's one other, generated value. In fact, that was something that hopefully you saw in the prep work. If you go to your cheese class here, I got a lot of stuff going on. Let me get some of this out of the way. There's our entity. I don't know why these are red. I know it works because I run it, and it works just fine. I don't know why these are red right now. Oh well. Yeah, and so here we can see that I can let the database manage its own ID, which is good. If we let humans manage primary keys, then guess what? We're going to screw it up. Primary keys are going to start colliding with each other, and it's going to be a big headache for everybody. So just let the computer do it. Just let the computer manage that part. All right, what's next? What is a data access object? That's not a straightforward question, necessarily. There's a lot of stuff going on in that question. Somebody want to take a stab at it? What's a data access object? What is it doing for us? What does the data access object do for us?
Interfacing with our objects, example, the cheese data access object that will interface with the cheese object.
Yeah, so we're actually. I'm glad you used that those terms there. We're in the process of taking something from a database and turning them into objects. We actually have a name for that. What's that called? When I'm taking stuff from a database, turning it into an object, or vice versa, I'm taking stuff from an object and putting it in a database. We have a name for that. Mapping, close, yeah. I mean, that's the last part of a 3-word object relational mapping. There you go, ORM, right? ORM. So that's a big piece of the ORM. And actually, the prep work introduced data access objects to you. In fact, I can show you the one that you saw in the prep work. It's going to be in this folder right here, this cheese DAO. It's an interface. I know you guys talked about interfaces last week. What's an interface do for us? What's an interface do for us? Defines a set of behaviors that can be reused. Yeah, defines a set of behaviors that can be reused. They don't actually tell you how those methods are going to work, right? It's a specification. It's kind of a blank slate. It says, you have to be able to do these things. How you do them, whatever. I don't care about that. I just want you to be able to do these things, right? That's what an interface is telling us to do. So without getting too much into review about that stuff, you can see that we've got this data access object that implements this interface, and you'll notice that it seems a little odd. The interfaces you saw last week, I'm sure, were a bit different than this because they're not. This one's empty. This one's actually empty, but it's not really empty. It does do some stuff. Where's it getting some stuff from? What's this word doing for us? What's that keyword? I think you saw this one last week as well, didn't you? What's that one do for us? Extends? There's a term for it. Inheritance. That's inheritance. Right? That's inheritance. So there is an interface called CRUD repository. We are inheriting everything that interface has. Everything that's in this CRUD repository interface, we are inheriting that all of that stuff into our own data access object interface called cheese DAO. Where does this interface come from? I think I heard somebody say it. That's part of the JPA. The CRUD repository, I believe, is part of the JPA. Now, what I would like to show you later on when we do some more hands-on coding stuff during the second part of today's review session is show you how we can actually put stuff in here to do work for us. We can actually include stuff in this interface that will make our lives easier, provide different ways of accessing our data. For now, though, I mean, this is as basic as it gets. We created a data access object interface that inherits from this data access object. What are these guys here? What do these represent? This first one is the object that we're creating the mappings for, right? The cheese object, the model that we want this data access object to be working with. What's this for? It's the type of the primary key, that's right. And you can verify that by taking a look at the cheese object over here and see that it is an int. Okay? So we need to know that information to create this data access object, but then we actually want to use it. So this is just setting up the data access object, but then we actually want to use it. That's what we saw over here in the controller, in the prep work. Right here, and you see this word above it, auto wire. What does that do? Sets up the links between the model and the table. It does, but how? I mean, that's part of the answer. There's more to it than that, though. What does auto wired actually do? Look, I mean, think about it. Think about it this way. It says I'm creating a private cheese DAO, right? This is the type, and then this is just a variable name. Right? Where does this come from? Down here you can see that in the rest of this, you can see that I'm using this like it's an object. Object.method, right? I'm using it just like it's an object. Where does that object come from? That's what AutoWire does for us. To create an object, we're used to calling the constructor. We're used to saying such and such equals new cheese DAO, right? And creating a new instance of an object. That's how we've been taught to create new instances of objects, right? By using AutoWired, we're saying, do it for us. We're telling Spring, hey, I want this thing. You know where to find it. The DAO specification's right over here. You know where that is. Make it for me. Just do it. Just make it for me. It's saving us some time. It's making it so that we don't actually have to manually create an instance of this object. We do not have to say such and such equals new cheese DAO, right? We don't have to say that. That's what AutoWire does for us. He said this really fast in the video, but this is a concept called dependency injection. Basically, we need this to do our job. Our application depends on this object. We're not going to bother to create it ourselves. We're going to let Spring create this object on our behalf and inject it into our application. Dependency injection. So again, it's a shortcut. We're allowing Spring to do more work for us. We're allowing Spring to do stuff for us so that we don't have to manually specify every single step along the way. It's kind of confusing because it hides things, right? If you were looking at this and you didn't know what this auto-wired annotation did, you'd be like, well, where is this created? Where do they create a new instance of this object? I don't see it anywhere. I'm very confused. And maybe some of you did that during the prep work. But auto-wired is doing all that for us on our behalf. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that piece? Yes? AutoWired is part of Spring, yes. Spring is what's hooking that up for us. That is correct. Any other questions? As you get more and more involved in the Spring world, if you choose to go down that path, if you want to work in that space, you'll see this a lot more often. This is a very Spring way of doing things. In fact, we've been kind of going out of our way up until this point in the class to sort of avoid doing this, just so that you get a feel for how to create objects and how to manipulate objects, because that's important. It's important to understand how all of that works so that you understand what this works, understand how this piece works. All right. I think we knocked those all out. Data access object, yeah, cool. Any other questions? Did I miss any questions anywhere? All right, let's talk about a couple more things. A few more annotations. We saw these on the data access object, actually. As a matter of fact, if I go back there. I've got two annotations. Again, unless you were listening very closely, it would be hard to miss, it would be easy to miss these in the prep work because you did kind of go through them really quickly, but they are important. Did any of you look these up or do a little bit more digging into what these actually are doing for us? Repository and transactional? In some sense, you can treat them as magic words, right? These are the magic words that make our data access object do what it needs to do. And if that's all you got out of the prep work, then that's actually going to get you pretty far. That'll get you a long way, right? But they actually are, there's more to it than that. There's more to it than that. This repository annotation is specifying that this is intended to work with the database. That is quite literally what it means. This is something that is intended to work with the database. This is a data access object. At some point along the line, it's going to interact with the database. That's what repository does. Transactional has to do more with the kind of database that we're using. We haven't gotten into this in our database discussions, but every interaction with the database that you perform, whether you are conscious of it or not, is part of a transaction. And what that really means is that it has clear start and end boundaries. You say, I'm about to begin a transaction. I'm about to do some stuff. You do some stuff, and then you say, okay, I'm done doing my stuff now. This is the end of our transaction. Every transaction has a clearly defined beginning and a clearly defined end. And by sticking this annotation in here, we're just saying our data access object needs to obey those rules. Needs to have clearly defined starting points and defined ending points to every transaction that it has with the database. That is it's a new concept. It's one that was not in the prep work, to be perfectly honest with you, but I do think it's important if you are interested in databases and how they work. Understanding transactions is a huge part of that. So if databases are something that you find interesting, databases are something you want to learn more about, you want to get more involved with, at some point along the way, you're going to want to look up transactions and how they work. It's a very critical piece. And so I just wanted to touch on those a little quickly because the prep work didn't get into a huge amount of detail with those ones. Any questions? We got one more topic, I think, to bring up with you, and then we'll do some coding. Any questions before we do that? All right, last but not least, we're going to talk about relationships. So today we're just going to talk about one-to-many relationships. We're going to talk about relationships more on Thursday as well. But for now, we can talk about one-to-many relationships. If I have a one-to-many relationship, what pieces do I need in my code to make that happen? What pieces do I need? So we need the one-to-many annotation. What else? A many-to-one annotation. So we're actually specifying both sides of the relationship, right? That's something that we actually also saw with the Flask implementation as well. We had to specify connections on both sides. This is the one side, this is the many side. So one-to-many goes on the one side, many-to-one goes on the many side of the relationship. From the prep work, and actually you'll do this today in Studio, I believe, or maybe Thursday in Studio, can't remember which day. You'll actually set up a one-to-many relationship between cheeses and categories like you kind of saw in the prep work. That'll be one of your tasks to work on in class. What else though? There's one other piece that we need to specify, at least one other piece. The join column, what's that do? The foreign key, I'm glad you used that term. That's exactly right. It's specifying what the foreign key is. So what is the relationship, right? How do we define the relationship? This column from this table equals the primary key column from this table. That's the definition of a foreign key. So we're specifying what the foreign key column should be. And once we set up those properties, right? Spring, JPA, Hibernate takes it from there. It does all the rest of the work for us. It handles all of that process. So it just goes ahead and makes those connections, and we can now use those relationships in our code. Great. All right, I wanted to do some coding with you, but before I do, any questions about any of the prep work, any of the review stuff? Yes. No, that's a great observation. So he mentioned that we specified the join column as category ID. That would have been in the category class, I believe. Is that what? Yeah, I think that's right. But we didn't actually create that. There's no field, right, in the cheese class called category ID. In fact, if we look at the cheese class, it's just called. Well, actually, this doesn't have the category in there yet, because you guys will add that as part of Studio today. But basically, to answer your question, the ORM will generate that column for us. Once we specify that that's what we want the join column to be, it will create that column for us and make sure that those values are populated accordingly with the proper values for the relationship. So it's generating all of that for us on our behalf. Great question. What other questions do you have? So I just wanted to do a quick exercise to wrap up today. You might remember for a couple weeks back, we actually set up some user stuff, right? We did a user sign-up exercise as part of our studio. And so I was thinking that we could actually take a moment here and talk about how to include users in our database, make these users persistent. And along the way, I want to show you something, a little bit above and beyond what was introduced to you in the prep work about how we can actually do some more customizable queries on our data. So if you have the user stuff that we did in Studio, you're welcome to follow along. If you don't worry about it. Just sit back and relax and let me do the driving. I'm happy to do that. Or actually, I'm hoping they'll help me out along the way. But just to kind of refresh our memories of what we actually did. Right now, if I go to user/add, you can see, oh, did I go the wrong, what? Oh, I didn't start it. That's probably what I did. I just need to run the thing. My fault. Come on now. It's going to take a while. Well, while this is going, let me explain what I want to do with you. I want to set it up so that these users can be stored in the database, right? And then I also want to do some other things. Once we store them in the database, we can do things like make sure that no two users have the same username. Right? We can update our sign-up form. We can add a little bit more functionality and make it so that no two users have the same username. So that's sort of a sneak preview of what I'm hoping that we get to today. Now this is running, we can take a look and see where we left off with this last. Oh, come on. What did I do now? Oh, shoot. You know what I did? I forgot to, oh, crap. I forgot to copy over my templates. Rats. Oh, shoot. Now I don't know what to do. I want to get those templates back. That's a real bummer. Sorry about that, everybody. Darn it. Are they on Slack, maybe? I did post them, I think, on Slack. Let me see if I can find them. Would have been a couple weeks ago. Oh, what is this? Hey, all right, perfect. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Thank goodness. All right. Crisis averted. This will take just a second. All right, there's one, and then I just need to grab the other one real quick, and then we'll be back in business. Oh, come on. This one was called index. Okay, cool. I think we're good to go. Let's try it out. Perfect. All right, great. Sorry about that. That was my fault. So, we made this little user sign-up form that allowed us to, sign up, make an account with a password. Oh, but it wanted a password to be, 8 letters long or something? And so we can sign up, and if we enter the proper information, it'll say hi, right? Tell us who it is. But it doesn't remember us, right? We don't have a login anywhere. We never implemented that functionality, though we certainly could. It just lets us sign up for an account, and then if I wanted to sign up with another account using the same email address or the same username, there's nothing to stop me from doing so, because it doesn't even remember the last account that I made. It has no idea that I even made that last account. Never happened. So what I'd like to do is make these accounts permanent. If we go through this process, we sign up our user, I want that to be saved to the database. I want this to be permanent. I want this to actually remember us, remember who we are. That'll allow us to do, like I was saying, some more validation. Make sure that we don't have users with the same username or the same email address. Make sure that and then it allows us to actually log in. And I'm not going to do this today because that'll take too much time, but it would allow us to associate lists of cheeses with certain users so that every user could have their own list of cheese, for example. I think that would be a great exercise. Unfortunately, I just don't think we'll have enough time to get quite that far today, but let's go ahead and get started with this and see how far we can get with the time that we have. So what's the first thing I'm going to do? If I want to save users to the database, where do I start? So here's the class that I've got for users. I want to make this usable, so I'm going to stick an entity annotation up there. And it needs the import, which I've been having trouble with these imports for whatever reason, so I will just go borrow these imports here from this one. I know that it works because the website works, but for some reason IntelliJ is arguing with me about it. Okay, what should the primary key of this be? What should the primary key of this object, this entity, be? Anybody have any ideas? I could make it the username. That is one option, right? I could make it the username. Think about the implications of that. Usernames, we generally do want them to be unique, right? We don't want to have duplicate accounts with the same username. So in that sense, it seems like a pretty good candidate for a primary key. But think about how primary keys are used in our database. If I have a user who owns a list of something, right, or owns anything, has a relationship with something, how is that relationship going to be marked? It's going to be used as a foreign key, which literally means I'm going to see that if I make username my primary key, and I then use it as a foreign key, I'm going to be stamping my username all over the database, right? All over the place. Can you think about why that might be problematic? Why is that maybe a bad thing to do it that way? Functionally, would it work? Sure. But I'm saying that there are maybe some downsides to that approach. Memory or space. A number takes up a lot less amount of space than somebody's username does. That's actually true. So it's going to save on space. I'm not saying that we want to do this, but it's certainly possible that we allow people to change their usernames, right? I don't have to keep the same username if I don't want to. If that's something that we want, but we're using username as a primary foreign key like that, that makes things very difficult for us because now I have to go through and find every single copy of it and change it if somebody wants to change that username, right? So I think in general, it's definitely good practice to generate a primary key, make up a primary key, outside of the actual information of the object. Just make up your own integer primary key. In fact, I mean, so in other words, what I'm saying is that what they do here for the cheese class, I honestly do this for 99.9% of the models that I create. That is how I do primary keys, period. It is sort of the de facto standard way of creating primary keys for these kinds of applications. So let's just grab this code and move it over here. It's not a problem. Okay. I think we're good. We now have our primary key set up. All right. Is there anything else I need to do to this part? Anything else I need to do to this class to get it ready for the database? If not, then what's my next step? What do I have to do next? Make a DAO, make a data access object. That'll be the next step. So I'll go over here, and here's my cheese DAO. So I'll go ahead and create another one. Whoops. It's going to be an interface, not a class, but an interface. Interface is not showing up on my list here.
You can do it as a class.
Oh yeah, it's just a drop down, right? Yeah, thank you. User DAO. Sure. And then there's a certain format that these need to follow, right? In fact, we can use our cheese DAO as kind of a guide here. So I'll go ahead and copy these annotations over that we need. Okay. We need another import as well, though, don't we? We need the... no, actually. Oh, we need this one here. We need this guy. Wrong file. Okay. But then we also need to do this extends CRUD repository. And what was the information that I had to provide along with this? The object, which is a user, and integer for the type of the primary key. So we need to import our user. We also need to import CRUD repository, which I can pull that import statement from here. All right. And so far, this is it. This is all we've been doing for our data access objects, right? Later, I want to come back to this and add some more stuff to it. I want to show you how we can actually customize these a little bit, make them a little bit different. But for now, this is good. For now, this is fine. So what's next? Where do we go from here? The controller. So we'll pop over to the controller, and when I add a, oh, I remember doing this from last time. That's not something we want anymore. But when I add a user, where am I at? This is the one for adding a user, right? Yeah. If I successfully add a user, that happens here, then I want to make sure that makes it to the database, right? So how do I do that? How do if I get to this point, I know that they've typed in valid information, and we're going to get, we're going to create a new user account form. How do I make sure that information gets to the database? What do I need to do? I need to auto-wire my DAO first. So I'll come over here, auto-wired, and then I'll make a private user DAO. Something like that. We need to import that guy. Okay, what's next? What am I going to do next? I've got my DAO. I've got the user object that I want to store. How do I connect those two together? User DAO dot save user. And that'll take the user object that was created and it'll put it in the database. That's what I hope it'll do anyway. Let's try it out. Let's see what happens. I do need to restart my program here. I might have made some mistakes somewhere along the way, but I think we mostly went through the process. All right. There we go. So let's refresh our page here and try this again. Type in our user information. All right. I think I typed in valid info. So, all right, logs me in, but let's actually check to make sure that it made it to the database. If I go back over here now, take a look at my cheese MVC database, I see, hey, there's a new table called user just popped up. That was not there before. I know I didn't show it to you before, but you'll have to take my word for it. It was not there before. If I click on this guy, I can now see that I have a user in here. There I am. But it still is missing some stuff. For example, I can come back here, right? Enter in another email, enter in another password, and sign up, and it didn't stop me from doing that. And now actually if I go back to my database and I take a look at what's in here, we can see that I now have 2 users with the same email address and the same username, right? It didn't stop me. It didn't stop me from making that happen. So that's something that I want to show you. How can we prevent stuff like that from happening? At a high level, let's not worry about code right now. At a high level, what would we want to do to prevent this from happening? We just need to query for the same username or email address, whichever one we care about, or both, right? If it works for one, it'll work for the other. So we need to look up get the information out of the box, look it up, see if it's in the database already. And if it is, we'll just tell them, hey, you can't do that, right? It didn't work, no good. Not going to happen, right? So now let's think about how we do that in code. Do I have a way of looking things up by username right now? Is that something that's possible? Think about how did Chris, who makes the videos for this class, how did he look stuff up? He was using the ID. Specifically, he was using that method find by ID. I believe, or find all. He did use find all, which just gets you everything, right? So one way you could solve this problem is, all right, just get everything, go through the whole list, and see if you can find somebody that has the same username. That would work. That would take a long time, especially if you have a very popular website. Imagine somebody like Facebook having to do that, right? Go through every single user that they have and make sure that nobody else has your login information already. That would take way too long. It would take forever. It'd be easier if we could just query the database, say, hey, does anybody have this username already? Is that already in there? And we could do that. That is something that we can do, but we need to update our data access object in order to do that. So let me show you how. Over here in the user data access object, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to make, I'm going to put a method in here. It's an interface, right? So it's just going to be the method declaration, not a method body. I'm not going to specify how this method works. I'm just going to put it in here. I'm just going to put this method in. I'll call it public. Or I'll say list of users. I'll say find by username. String username. Okay? I chose some of these things very carefully. Very, very, very carefully. This method name in particular, find by, those first 2 words were chosen very, very carefully. The Spring framework, the way that we access data, if I stick a method in here with those 2 words, find by or query by, it will treat this as a special query method. And then it will examine what comes after it, in this case, username. It will look at this and see if there is a field in my class, in my model, that has this name. And there is, right? There is. Username, it's right there. And if it finds that match, it will then say, all right, they have written a query method. They want to be able to look people up by this particular property, by this particular column. I will set up how this method is supposed to work to make that happen. I don't even have to specify how that works, right? I don't have to fill out the method. I don't have to do anything. I just have to specify that this method definition inside of my data access object. And Spring takes care of the rest for me. So now I can use this method. Notice the return type is a list of users. Now you might be thinking, well, there's only, there's either going to be 1 or 0, right? So having a list of users might seem a little bit much. That's more of a specification. The database does not know that. The database does not know that there's only going to be 1 or 0. We know that, but the database does not. The database thinks that there could be many people with the same username because we haven't told it anything differently. We have not told it anything otherwise, that those usernames have to be unique. So, right? So it'll give us back a list, but think about what that does for us. We can now check the list. If the list is empty, nobody's got that username, so we're good to go. If the list is not empty, then somebody's already got that username, so we have a problem. We can tell our user that it's already been taken, and they can pick something different. Make sense? So let's do that part. Let's hook up the rest of it. I go back to my user controller. And so here we're checking to see, right, if we have errors or if the password does not match. Well, we now have another one to verify as well. Let me break this into pieces, actually. Yeah, what's up? I'm sorry? How do you... Just make sure you end it with a semicolon. It's just a method, just the method declaration ended by a semicolon. So let's do, the first thing we want to do is see if there's, let's just go ahead and grab that list, right? List of user, same name equals user DAO dot. And now we can, look, it just popped right up. Find by username. Brilliant. That's exactly what we want to use. What username am I going to plug in here? Where does that kind of come from? The model. Well, let's be careful what we mean by model, because we actually have two different things called model. Not this model, but this model, the user object. So it'll be user.getUsername. Okay? So again, remember, I need to import this. If this list is empty, nobody's got that username, and we're free to go. If that list is not empty, then we want to tell the users that somebody's already picked it and they need to pick something else. So here we can just update this and say same name dot is empty, right? If these tests pass and nobody else has that name, then we're good to go. Down here, though, we have a little bit more work to do. We need to check to see if there's somebody in there and set an error message if there is. So if same name, we actually want the opposite of that. If it's not empty, model.add attributes. Now, how are we going to add this in? This is sort of a review at this point. We don't have a spot for this error message to go necessarily. I don't have a spot for that, but I can make one in my template. If I go to my add template here, kind of like what we did for verify, right? There's a thing down here. Where did do I not? Oh, okay. Oh, is this an old version? This doesn't have the, I must have grabbed an old version of this template because this doesn't have the, that's fine, whatever. It's okay. So I'll just put it in this message. That's fine. Okay, let's try it out. Let's make sure that it works. You can clearly see, right, that I've got me in here twice already. So if I rerun my program and I try to add another account for myself, I'm hoping, if I did everything properly, that it will tell me that I can't do that. So we'll restart this guy and then try and make another account. Build successful, okay, cool. All right. I'm gonna try and make another account with me. Boom, username is taken, please select another one. The formatting is a little but whatever. The functionality is there, and formatting can be tweaked. So it worked. It worked. And now we have the ability to query not just by ID, but by any property of a model that we want to. We can take that a step farther. So this is great. The format that I showed you is great if I'm querying by one of the existing properties. Very simple, very easy to use. I didn't do email, but you could already imagine what an email version of this would look like, right? It would be very similar to this one, or any other property that I wanted. Well, we can take that a step farther if we want to. There's another annotation that you can use called query. I can put in a query annotation, and in parentheses after this annotation, I can put a SQL query with a parameter in it. And if that same parameter shows up in my method, that's going to tell Spring to take whatever values passed in, plug it into the SQL query, run the query, and return those results. So now I'm not able to query just by primary key or by a particular property, but any SQL query that I can possibly think of, right? I can now manually put into this query annotation and write a method to access it in my data access object. This is really why data access objects are so powerful. Very, very powerful tools. It lets us forget about all the stuff that we need to do to interact with the database and just write the SQL query, just write the access, or not even have to write SQL. In this case, I didn't even have to write a single lick of SQL to get this to work. I just had to set up a method stub in my interface, and it was good to go, right? So that's really why data access objects are so powerful. I didn't want to let you guys walk out of here thinking that data access objects are just going to be these empty interfaces that you have to set up to connect to a database. They're really much more than that. They're really very powerful tools that can help you a lot in terms of your application and what you can do with your models. Are there any questions about that? Any questions at all? Yeah, in the back. Did I keep it from what?
Creating another one? It had an error, but did it actually?
Oh, that's a good question. I didn't actually prove it, huh? Let's go back and see if it actually prevented it. Yeah. There were 2 in there before, and there's still 2 in here now. There's not a third one. Now, the fact that I have 2 in here is kind of a problem too, right? But, you know. Actually, while we're on the topic, I made a big no-no with what I'm doing here in the first place, right? These passwords, you guys should not be able to see those. We talked about that in Unit 2. What should I be doing? Hashing and salting those passwords. Java can do that too, no problem. So I don't have time to show you that right now, unfortunately. But Java absolutely can do that as well. You can use the same hash functions we were using in Python and Java, no problem. If we were going to take this example farther, which maybe we'll do that on Thursday, we would hash these, we would salt these And then something else we could do. Hopefully you can see how to do this. I'm about out of time. I don't have time to do it, but you can make a login page now too, right? I can make an actual login page where they type in their username and password. We look it up. You might have to extend your data access object a little bit more, right? Well, no, the username one would be enough, actually. The username one would be plenty to get that done. But now you can do it. What other questions did you have about this? Any other questions? Yes?
Query application, right? Like having SQL.
Yeah, you just stick a SQL query in here. Select so-and-so from so-and-so. Yep. Now, what you would typically do is, at some point in this query, in order for it to be particularly effective, you would want to put in, some kind of a parameter. So, where, name equals, right, blank or something like that. And then down here, you would make a parameter to the method that matches this. And then that would tell it to take whatever value is passed into this method, substitute it into the SQL query, and then execute it that way. We call that a parameterized query, a query that's got a hole in it. And then when we call the method, it plugs that hole with data, runs the query, gives us back the values that we want. I'll be honest with you, these are so powerful, the ones that allow you to query by particular columns. These are so common and so powerful that I don't often feel the need to write a lot of manual queries. But it is there. Yes? This works just fine. This is totally good. If I'm querying by a property that already exists, this is perfect. This is good. I don't need to mess with it. But if I have a query that's more complex, then I'm probably going to have to spell it out. Yeah. Yep. And that can be a tricky part of application development too, is figuring out exactly what queries you want to get the job done. At the end of the day, you really want your controller should only be accessing the exact amount of information that it needs to do its job, right? I could write a query, I could just get everything every time, right? Just grab entire tables in every time and go through everything and find what I want. But that's going to take a long time. And that's going to be a lot of data that's moving back and forth between your computer and the database. And that's going to take time. So really, I think it's important to consider, all right, what can I do? What query can I write? What query can I run that's going to give me exactly the information that I need to do my job and nothing more than that? Exactly the amount that I need to answer this question that I have and no more. And once you figure that out, you can add the appropriate pieces into your data access object to make that happen. It takes some practice, but it's a good skill. I'm positive that you'll start running into this stuff when you, if you're proceeding on to liftoff, or even if you're not, you're working on your own projects, you're going to run into this stuff sooner or later. What other questions do you have? We good? So there is a studio today. It's a big studio. In fact, I think it's like a 3-parter. So, and you're not meant to do it all today. So don't freak out when you see how big the studio is. You're just meant to do the first part today. So go ahead and get started on that first part. You do have an assignment due today as well, so go ahead and get that demoed and then maybe think about looking at that last assignment too. I'll go over part 1 of the studio around 8 o'clock. So let us know what you need. Thanks.